The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 25th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand, and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into the eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
And please be seated. Well, today is Stewardship Sunday at United Lutheran Church. So why do I think that makes some of you groan inwardly? Oh, is it that time of the year again? Maybe you've come to think of stewardship as the church's annual begathon. We don't talk about money all year long, even though Jesus talks about it plenty, and then it's all we hear about for a month. I hear you. Personally, I have heard too many church stewardship Sundays that are based on really lousy theology. The emphasis is all about the need to give to meet a budget rather than lifting up giving as a spiritual practice, part of our lives of faith, living out our mission. Or sometimes the argument has been made that if you just give to God, God is going to give back to you even more. Like this is all some sort of divinely directed investment scheme to benefit your self-interest. So what is stewardship really? Stewardship is a response to the question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean to follow Jesus? It's a question that we're all called to wrestle with as believers, both individually and as a community of believers. For certainly our Christian faith is about more than a set of ideas in our minds, doctrines in a book, or even a feeling in our hearts. Following Jesus is about how we live the abundant love, grace, and forgiveness of God in Jesus. Our year-round stewardship team chose as the gospel reading for this morning this parable from Matthew 25. It's a text that's associated usually not with Stewardship Sunday, but with Christ the King Sunday. And yet stewardship is all about what it means for us to live under the reign of Christ. In the scene in this parable, the nations are all gathered before the Son of Man who is seated in glory. And all people are separated into two groups, the sheep and the goats. And yet, what these two groups have in common is that both those identified as the sheep, as well as those named as goats, are surprised by what Jesus says to them. They respond to the verdict that they receive, not with defensiveness or self-congratulations, but rather with surprise. Lord, when did we see you? Or, Lord, when didn't we see you? Neither the sheep nor the goats defend their inaction or commend their actions. Rather, it seems they're both just surprised, baffled by their failure to have recognized Jesus. They can't believe that they did not see him. Jesus makes it clear here that he is present in the least ones, in the lost ones, in the last ones we would have ever expected. But then our God has a habit of showing up in surprising places, places we would have never expected. God came to us in the flesh as a vulnerable infant, all wrapped up and lying in a manger in Bethlehem, of all places. God came to us in the cross of Jesus, an instrument of shame and scandal. And God continues to come to us where we might least expect God to be, in the needs of our neighbors, especially those we are least likely to notice. I think it's a holy thing to notice. I think being noticed holds the power of healing and redemption for our lives and for this world. Shauna Nyquist, a Christian author and blogger, posted this reflection on her Facebook page recently. She wrote, "This is what we want. We want to be seen. This is such a core human desire. We want someone to understand the reality of what we're carrying, to sit with us in the pain, to not flinch or look away or pretend, to acknowledge. Because sometimes we all feel invisible or forgotten. Sometimes we want to know that at least one person isn't buying the everything's fine song and dance. We want to be seen." She writes, "I can't tell you what it has meant to get those texts, to have someone in my life say to me, 'I see you.' And it makes me want to offer that same rare and important gift to others. I see you." If being seen holds the power to be sustaining and life-giving, consider how important it is to say to people on the margins, "We see you." As followers of Jesus, I think seeing and noticing is the place where we need to begin. Because we're not called here simply to charity, but God calls us into relationship. We're called to look at each other and see Christ. And this seeing changes and shapes our hearts and our response. That's why we travel all the way to Africa, Tanzania. It's why we invite our neighbors to meet us on the front lawn and in the parking lot, because we're not called to projects or checklists. We're called to people, to God's people. The best noticer that I've ever known is our daughter Rachel. She noticed things that most people miss. When she was only 3 years old, I heard her to say to someone coming into church one morning, "Good morning, Mrs. Olson. Did you get a new necklace? I really like it." And I watched Mrs. Olson, who I knew was struggling and frankly a rather grumpy person, suddenly brighten and smile and enter into a conversation. I would have never noticed that new necklace. After Rachel died, we received so many lovely messages, many of which testified to how she noticed people. A member of the church where Rachel was the director of faith formation told us about her granddaughter. This little one was so terribly shy that she hated going to Sunday school. But then one morning she told her grandma, "You know, I'm not afraid to go to Sunday school anymore because Rachel knows me. She knows my name." We are called to see each other, to see Christ in one another, to see Christ in the needs of others, especially those in greatest need whom the world doesn't see and neglects. The parable before us today not only calls into question where we typically look for God, but it actually reorients us to discover and to experience God's presence in our lives more fully than ever before. In this parable, Jesus promises to be with us and among us in those who are in greatest need, which means if we want to experience God's presence more fully and deeply and truly, we will look for God in the needs of those around us and perhaps in our own need as well. I recently heard a pastor talking about stewardship, and he said that several years ago his wife had lost her job. They had committed as a family to giving a tithe, 10% of their income away as a biblical and spiritual practice. And so minus now one income, the amount that they were able to give decreased. But he was determined still to practice living generously. And so he decided that one thing he could do was to start tipping servers generously. And he asked the group of church leaders he was addressing, "Do you know what happened? I started noticing servers in new ways. I took time to exchange a few words with them. I learned a little bit about their stories. I became more aware of how difficult it is to make your way in the world on minimum wage or less." Jesus said to those who would follow him, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." We sometimes think it's the other way around, but that's not what Jesus said. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. When we invest in something or someone, we notice it in new ways, and it makes its way into our hearts and lives in new ways. This morning, you are asked to make, again, a financial commitment to Christ's work through this congregation for a new year. And could it be that it is as Jesus said, that as you make this commitment to the work, the ministry, the mission of this congregation, that your heart will also follow? For when we invest in something, it shapes our hearts, our lives, our commitments, our values. This is why giving is a spiritual practice and not simply a way to raise funds. During the months of July and August, when even the most routine things were difficult, many of you brought meals to our home. And I found that even though I didn't feel like eating when someone set food in front of me, I could take at least a few bites. Kindness was sustaining. One family set a table for us. They put on a tablecloth, disposable dishes, and some wonderful food. And I turned to them and I said, as I hope I said to many of you, "This is so kind and generous of you." And the response I received was this: But isn't that what we've been put here to be? To be kind and generous. God, who sees us, who is kind and generous to us, calls us to see, and seeing, live in kind and generous ways. It's how we take our part in God's work in this world. It's what it means to follow Jesus. Amen.